Okay, thank you all for coming. I'm impressed at how full the room is. A good number of you are undoubtedly in the wrong place. So I'm told that 3 o'clock is the watershed time here in Las Vegas. What's a broadcast term for those of you who don't know? So now we can get into the adult content. We can talk about the F word. So I was actually told, no, you can't come to Identiverse and talk about Federation because nobody's going to come. Who knows? But Andy kind of gives me a free hand, and my sponsors for my guides, who I deeply apologize for not actually showing them my slides before I spoke. It's always a deep mistake. So I have about 3 to 4 hours worth of content. But given that I have about 20 minutes, I basically removed all the detail. That's me. That's by my house in Canada. So I'm an architect at Yubico. So I'm irresponsible for a bunch of passkey and WebAuthn stuff, which I will talk nothing about now. So in the beginning, now to some extent, we have built the internet largely on direct trust relationships. On OAuth, on a lot of protocols, you go to the IDP, you get a client ID, you trust the IDP because you went to them. The IDP asks you for some information, and they trust you because you've gone through some sort of registration process. So we have a direct bilateral relationship. And that works to a certain extent, but has sort of obvious scaling issues. The next sort of model that we move to is kind of a hub and spoke, where you do actually have some sort of transitive trust, but through having a central hub or proxy. So in research and education, we tend to use proxies a lot. Ping. Once upon a time, I guess Ping still does have some sort of hub offering, but Entra, a lot of people, you as an enterprise either directly keep your identities in there or federate in, and the SaaS providers trust you because you're going through some sort of central trusted authority. That also has a good number of scaling issues. So that's where we've largely been for sort of the first part of traditional federation protocols. Then about 2005, Scott Cantor, emailer, and a bunch of other malcontents published SAML 2, and as part of that created SAML metadata. And that allowed an indirect kind of transitive trust. So I just arbitrarily picked universities. I'm sorry if yours wasn't mentioned directly, people in the room. So there are actually 782 participants in InCommon. As of a couple of days ago, there's roughly 600 IDPs and 6,000 SPs in the InCommon aggregate. But we have, and this is real stuff that people use every day. Currently on the internet, we have EduGain as the central hub for all the national federations. There's 78 national federations currently in EduGain. Like I say, InCommon has roughly 600 IDPs, 6,000 SPs. SWAMED, which is the Swedish Research and Education Federation. UMIA, which is a lovely university which some of our friends teach at or have taught at. There's 63 members of SWAMED, and overall there's 78 university federations around the world, and basically lots and lots of IDPs and SPs, so many that I gave up attempting to count a long time ago. But the advantage of this sort of hierarchical transitive trust is that IDP at Duke can allow a student to log in to a relying party resource at UMIA without any sort of pre-configured direct trust, because there's metadata that was created that InCommon publishes and EduGain publishes, that all of these participants, this Duke University IDP can walk the trust chain to the SP, and the SP can walk the trust train to internet to InCommon. Both sides can decide that they trust each other without necessarily ever having seen each other before. And people can get access to resources. There's lots of things like the radio telescopes in Chile, the SLAC, or the nuclear accelerator at CERN, which I once was thrown out of university for appropriating resources for. They had very weak identity security at that point in time, and I happened to be the largest user of the mainframe at one point. They weren't using it for anything useful. I had better things. Anyways, that was a long time ago. That was one of the things that first interested me in identity security, was other people's lack of it, which struck me as an opportunity. But in order to scale lots of things talking to lots of other things, the way that we have developed is this sort of federation protocol. We created initially big XML blobs that were aggregated up, and then a few years ago we RNE rolled out. The problem is that once you get to a certain size with a SAML file, it eats all of your memory, and then it eats your children, and bad things happen. So there is a per entity query protocol that's been introduced so that people's computers don't blow up their memory, because there's just, even if you're talking about InCommon, that's a big enough XML file to give people indigestion. So what does this have to do with wallets, you say? Well, I actually do have a huge graphics department behind me, which I've never actually spoken to, which explains my slides. The thing of it is that in sort of the simple two-party federation system, there's a relatively simple path for establishing trust. But what we've done by adopting these things that we call distributed, which I tend to think of as a three-party model. So essentially, we've taken the IDP and broken it into two pieces and said, boy, are we smart. So the reason for doing that is that it gives you some additional privacy properties, that you don't necessarily want the IDP to know where the user is using that credential. So that generally goes back to, do you want the motor vehicle department to know every time somebody buys alcohol online, which is, I think, the main use for online identity in the US besides tobacco. There's another thing that it's used for, but I don't know that we're actually late enough to talk about that. But there's only 3 things that make money on the internet, as far as I know. But now, when we break the IDP is effectively the issuer, the thing that provides the claims, and the wallet instance. So in order to blind the issuer to where these claims are going, what you do is make things more complicated by adding a piece of software that's going to sit in the middle and needs to be trusted by, if you're going to issue a credential to, and I'm involved in a bunch of the large-scale pilots in Europe for the European EID system. So by law, each of the nation states in Europe is going to be an issuer for personal identity documents for every one of their citizens. They're going to certify one or more wallets on a per-country basis, which may wind up with, regional wallets is one of the concerns that some people have is that, if the verifier can figure out what wallet you use, then you may actually be leaking information about what country you live in if the wallet is tied to the country that you live in. So we may actually, in some ways, if we're not careful, we may actually wind up leaking more privacy information than we've preserved, but hey, it's government work. The thing is that the issuer, so if I'm Germany and they're Germans, so they're going to certify one or more wallets. So what you don't want to release provision identity documents into a wallet that's going to be badly behaving and not conform to your privacy principles. So in Europe, there is a certification program that's going to happen for relying parties. So unless you have the appropriate certification, there's a certificate called the QWAC that you have to get that will identify you as being good or some extent. It's sort of like an EV certificate for in the TLS world, but this will identify people that are entitled to be able to receive claims from a personal identity document. So the issuer needs to trust, not necessarily, first they need to trust the wallet provider. The wallet provider needs to be able to identify its wallet instances that are on devices and be able to produce something that can be trusted by the issuer. But if issuers are not going to, if issuers are going to support any wallets that aren't produced by themselves, we're going to need some sort of certification program, some way of identifying all of those things, and potentially allow issuers to have some sort of policy that they can express to the wallet, because not every issuer is going to have the same policy. Right now, and the mindset in the European Union is, we'll deal with that later, which is a response I get quite often. Well, what we'll do is we'll have static trust lists, and we're going to burn all of the logic into the wallet. And so this guy will only trust its own wallets, and the wallets will have a static list of all of the RPs that it's allowed to talk to. Okay, Dean has the expression like, how the hell is this going to scale globally? I love that expression on your face. Yes. It's similar to is that a deer in my headlights? So the issuer transitively needs to be able to trust the verifier in some way. So if we're going to scale this, verifiers are going to need some trust mark that's probably broader, or trust marks, because you may have to have one for Europe, one for the US. It's hard to imagine that the European Commission and the state of California are going to agree on anything, never mind what the trust mark standards are for somebody being able to get personally identifying information from an electronic credential that they've provisioned. It would be nice. That's the goal. But right now, AMVA actually hasn't. AMVA is another one of, we'll deal with that. Right now, we'll just start by giving everybody everything, unless we don't give anybody anything, but we'll just make a decision at some point. But the AMVA, the American Motor Vehicle Association, which also includes Canada and the Caribbean and I don't know where else, they're creating a static trust list of all the states, because you can't actually, states are all self-sovereign in some, so you can't actually create a PKI hierarchy above the states, because all you can do is have a co-equal listing of all of their root certificates for political reasons. There's a lot of politics that sort of interweave with this, but initially we're going to have all of these relationships encoded in static lists, which people are either going to download or be baked into the particular pieces of software. and a number of us have concerns that this may have scalability and interoperability. So since I don't necessarily even have a country that I identify with anymore, I have, since I'm operating across many jurisdictions in many different dimensions, this is actually a personal problem for me. Sort of cross-border interoperability. And the European Union, when I ask questions like, well, how is a website, you're passing a law saying the top 5 or 9 social networks have to accept verifiable credentials for user authentication, which absolutely nobody knows what that actually means, but it's a law. So if I'm Facebook or Google or even Amazon potentially, what does, do I really want to, if you go to the wrong landing page, do I want to not be able to log you in if you've landed on the US site for one of these properties because, I don't have the right European Union QWAC as my TLS certificate, versus, are we going to wind up accidentally re-balkanizing the internet by enforcing different pools of identity where everything is regional? I have like 4 minutes. Great. So, we have way more trust relationships that we need to be able to model for the three-party federation. Then we sort of stack on the problem of every wallet is probably going to need to have multiple credentials to do different things. I may have a BC driver's license, a Chilean driver's license. Don't tell either country that I have dual driver's license because that's definitely illegal. And my academic credentials, should I ever recover them, your transcripts, etc. All of these things are going to have different trust relationships. In EduGain, we have entity categories. So depending upon what kind of entity you are, you get a different subset of SAML attributes from a university. So if you're a commercial entity, you don't get all of the student information which might be released to another university. And that's because there's common policies around how people are authenticated, what these attribute bundles are, what they mean, that exist across these federations. So the federations, so we keep thinking about what is the protocol flow and how do these messages move around, but we actually have another layer, which is a trust layer, which has to live on top of this and be able to be interrogated by the various parties so that they can so wallets can actually have credentials that have different policies from different issuers, that relying parties, when we're working with Apple and Google on doing a JavaScript API for being able to invoke wallets, which is going to blind the relying party, at least initially, to what wallet the person has, because just going to a website and disclosing what wallets you have on your computer is like a great way for them to fingerprint you. So we want to hide what wallets people have, but at that point, the relying party doesn't know how to identify themselves. They don't know whether they're going to be talking to a European wallet, a Uruguayan wallet, an American wallet, a Texas wallet, once that happens. So we need to be able to have metadata that the relying party, have the verifier, which used to be called the relying party, express, this is my identifier, this is the information about me, and if you happen to be a European wallet, this is my trust mark for Europe, this is my trust mark for Uruguay, this is my trust mark for independent Texas, and so on and so forth. So we think that the federation model will allow scalability beyond the static trust list that people have been envisioning, and allow issuers to potentially trust new wallets that they didn't make themselves through some sort of certification and being able to interrogate the trust marks and being able to validate the signatures from the wallet issuers. So now that we're out of time, do I still have 5 minutes? Okay, then I might have time for a question. So get your pointy questions ready for me, or we can always slip over into the break. They're not gonna throw us out. I pick on AMVA, the European Commission. They recently put me on the advisor group for the European Commission. I think it's that we want you in the tent peeing out rather than on our shoes all the time, sort of thing. We really want to think this through carefully and not recreate identity silos and not make the world worse because people are inappropriately disclosing information to people that they shouldn't. Just generally we want goodness as opposed to rushing into things that may, if we don't rethink the trust model with this, we're going to create those sorts of, if we rely on bilateral relationships, it just simply won't scale. And verifiable credentials will die. I know, the various, there isn't, this is mostly a political problem and an organizational problem. Like blockchain isn't going to magically solve this. This is, we actually have to figure out who we trust, figure out ways of sharing that information and scaling it. So, questions? I can. I don't know if it's recording this. Okay. This could be your time to watch it. So.
Okay, so what's the idea behind certifying a verifier? It's different from the current model. I go to a bar. My government knows nothing about the person at the bar checking my ID. Why do they need to know and trust the person at the bar in the future to verify my verifiable credential?
The concern is that that relying party can ask for and persist other information than your age. So this is a more of a permanent transaction as opposed to somebody with bad memory who's probably had several drinks just scanning your driver's license. There's the issuers have a fiduciary responsibility. So if the state gives you a driver's license and it's kind of up to you, they don't have any way of knowing what you're doing with it. But most of the governments are concerned that people will unknowingly overshare their information. So it may be that you need a trust mark to get you may need a much lower level of trust to just get the over 18 pseudonymously, but to get the person's actual driver's license number or national ID number, you may need to actually be a government agency. So there's likely different levels of attributes that will be available to relying parties that have different trust. And once we develop the wallets further, maybe some of it will just be advisory, like these guys really shouldn't be asking you for this, but if you really want to share it, you can override this. But unless we actually have some way of communicating that to the wallet and then back to the user, it's really hard to give people good advice. And I think giving people good advice when we're giving them bigger guns to shoot themselves in the foot with from a privacy perspective is probably not a bad idea. More questions?
This space is both moving very fast and very slow at the same time. The use cases that Europe is trying to build out with their national IDs is similar to what the U.S. is trying to build out with the mobile driver's licenses, but the solution that fits those use cases should probably be a different solution than the one that fits like commercial identity, except the problem is is that if you spin up a whole different thing that looks somewhat similar but is different and not interoperable, then you have not interoperable systems that are doing similar things, further muddying the waters, further making it impossible to explain what the hell is going on in here. And then we end up in a situation where that people like to joke about, where we have too many standards, which in some sense we already do. And then none of this stuff is going to go anywhere. And 5 years later, whatever Google and Apple and Mozilla actually support in their software that people use on their phones every day is whatever is going to win. And none of our talk about standards and whatever will have mattered. So how do we preempt basically that cycle of this fizzling out?
That's one of the reasons why I've Leif Johansson sucked me into the European large-scale pilots, is we need to actually engage and get our requirements in. So that's one of the, identify the gaps. Like, I think we actually need a way for the issuers to describe the policy that the behavior they expect from the wallet to the wallet, so that if I have a wallet that's certified to enforce whatever policy and language description this is, then I'm not necessarily going to be, I can have different kinds of credentials. So the policy for my gym membership may be way less restrictive than the policy for my national ID, my Aeroplan, frequent flyer. Air Canada may decide that, you can only present this at Star Alliance relying parties or something. So giving people the flexibility to design these essentially independent federations in a way that can ride the same rails. So I think there's still a lot of stuff that we need to figure out, because everybody's going, well, I'll just design my little thing that works amongst the people. Nobody's really up-leveling it to figure out, how do I actually create infrastructure that these various mini federations can take advantage of? And that's partially because nobody's thinking of it as a federation problem yet. So I think that's, if you're going to take away something from this, it's like change your perspective and try and look at how the relationships can be modeled. How are we going to scale communicating that information between the parties and providing the right amount of runtime information to tailor it to the user's needs? Anything else before we all go and have our snack?